you looking for a different level of truth about your challenges and struggles? Then be a part of the Yes and podcast, hosted by empowerment strategist and trauma specialist Jennifer Whitaker. Every Wednesday, we challenge conventional thinking on topics like trauma, healing, and so much more. Learn life lessons and great nuggets of wisdom from guests who've moved through their pain and suffering to discover a new purpose in life. Now, here's your host, Jennifer Whitaker.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Yes And. I'm Jennifer Whitaker, your host. And this week, our guest is Belinda Eriachowho. Belinda comes from a lineage of the Diné, which is known to us as the Navajo, and the Ashwii, which is known to us as the Zuni, located in the southwest of the United States. After a long professional career, Belinda decided to give back to her communities by sharing cultural traditions and life experiences. Through her own personal healing journey along the corn pollen path of life, love, loss, grief, abuse, healing, illness, and renewal of the self, she is able to assist others in the process. She understands life's challenges and the joys that are presented to us. And these challenges are actually gifts along our life's journey toward Hozho. Hozho is a way of life that means to walk through life in balance with all living things around us in everything that we do. We each have a choice to live a life of happiness and a sense of freedom. Belinda, that's beautiful. Welcome to the show, and it's an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for allowing me to be on your show today.
Well, I'm glad that you agreed to be here. I'm excited to have this conversation. And in the intro, you mentioned the corn pollen path of life. Can you tell us a little bit about that? That's not typical language that we hear in Caucasian communities.
Yes, absolutely. So most of the tribes in the Southwest are actually corn people, meaning that a lot of their subsistence comes from the corn. And for the Diné, because I'm Diné, I follow my mother's lineage, and we use corn pollen, which comes from the tassels of the corn, when we go out and we pray in the morning. And so when we offer prayers to the holy people, we ask for the blessings of the day. And that doesn't necessarily always mean that they're good things. We realize that life has its ups and downs. And so there are lessons that we learn throughout our lives. And that is what we mean by the corn pollen path. And we take that from a day-to-day standpoint.
Oh, that's beautiful. And yeah. I've learned similar lessons, that some of the biggest challenges that I've encountered in my life, and some of the deepest pits I've been in, have been some of the biggest blessings.
Absolutely.
Once you get to the flip side of it. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that's kind of what you're talking about here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So Belinda, can we start out by having you tell us just a little bit about yourself? I know that you said that you had a long professional career. I got to be honest, just reading between the lines, I'm assuming that career was a little unfulfilling because you didn't talk much about it.
Actually, I ended up working as a compliance manager for an investor-owned utility for almost 26 years. And what I did for a living is I inspected power plants, everything from nuclear, gas, coal. And what I was looking for were compliance with requirements. So OSHA requirements are safety and health requirements, environmental, air quality, water quality, management of hazardous waste, etc. So that's what I did for a living. And it was a fulfilling career. I think like any other job, when you start to move up the corporate ladder, you have a lot more struggles and challenges. Folks don't always see your perspective on things, but it was a rewarding career, and it allowed me to interface with a lot of professional people at different levels of the organization. And I really enjoyed my job. I really enjoyed the people that I work with. It taught me a lot. And one of the things to understand is that in a Native American traditional culture, it's so opposite of the corporate structure, where in our Native American communities, we're very tightly knit. We know each other. Whereas in a corporate setting, it's really more formal. It's about the titles. It's about the different acronyms that you have after your name. And interesting enough, when I started working for this company, I had 2 sets of business cards. I had a set of business cards that were related to my professional career, my certifications. And then I had another set of business cards that would just had my name. So when I went up to work on the reservation at some of our power plants, that's the card that I used, because we were always taught to humble ourselves and who we are as Diné people. And so that was kind of my way of introducing that into my professional life.
Ah, that's beautiful. And I love how, I'm going to language it a little bit differently than you did, but you're essentially talking about what you were talking about, what you put in the introduction, like balance, walking through life in balance. Because there is the polarity of, like on one hand, we have the corporate world, and on the other hand, there's a more traditional approach.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And it's so important, I believe, to start to understand different communities and different lineages that people come from. Because my lineage, I've had my DNA tested through 23andMe. I'm all European.
Okay.
Eastern European, some up into Siberia. So there's a little bit into the Asian continent, but at the same time, almost predominantly European. And the hierarchy and the titles, that comes through my lineage. Not so much the tribal communities. It's not so much accepted to be who you are. You have to be who you're told to be in my lineage.
Yes.
And
I think that some of that comes from the patriarchy and the way that that's structured.
yes.
Where matrilinear, you think about our mothers and their lineage, and it's really about caring for the family. It's caring about the collective. So it's, as a Native person working in a professional career, it's really having to walk in both worlds. You always hear about walking in 2 worlds, that kind of phrase. And that's really what that means, is really understanding who you are and then where your place in the world is, and then being able to navigate in between both. That is exactly what that means.
Yeah. And that's been a lesson for me over the last 10 years of my life, is learning to walk in both worlds, like you're saying, because I've started to get into smaller communities and, have some interactions. And I think that, just being a Caucasian, I think we have a lot to learn from minorities and people of color in how to walk that line and, toe that balance.
Well, and I think the other part of that, Jennifer, is that for a lot of European people that I've met, they've forgotten they've forgotten about their cultures, either because it was not passed down through their parents or their grandparents. And so sometimes they struggle with that. Where do I even begin to pick up those pieces and learn about who I am? Yeah.
And that's absolutely true in my family. Just a lot of silence whenever I ask questions about those who have come before me. Even grandparents who passed before I was born, zip the lip, and very little is said about it. And which kind of leads me into, like, I know we were going to talk about intergenerational trauma. I believe intergenerational trauma is something that affects everybody, and it's part of our what I call the hidden control panel, because it affects the implicit mind, not our cognitive mind. So it's not in our conscious awareness. So can you help us understand what is intergenerational trauma?
Sure. One of the things that I would, say as I'm going through this conversation with you, if there are things that resonate in your listeners, if they're feeling some emotional uneasiness about some of the dialogue that's happening, I would ask them to get a piece of paper out and just kind of jot that down. Because there's something there that we can talk about when we, the further we go into this conversation, that would be helpful for them to find some answers to that question. There is a lady by the name of Michelle Cerrito. She is from the University of Nevada, and she provides a 3-part definition of the process of what intergenerational trauma is. And this is not only, again, true for Native American people, but also for other people, Europeans that have migrated into the United States. But essentially what happens is a dominant culture, in this case the US government, commits mass trauma upon a people. which are typically, in this case, the Native American people. And then the second part of that definition, it talks about the Native American people then exhibit physical and psychological symptoms as a result of that trauma that was caused. And then finally, what ends up happening is the original people or my ancestors who have experienced this trauma will pass that emotional responses on to the next generation. And sometimes it'll skip a generation. There are some very interesting studies that were done with Holocaust survivors. And they noticed that the same symptoms that the actual individuals who were in the concentration camps had were actually recognizable in their grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And so there's some real interesting research, that we can talk about in a little bit. But that's essentially what intergenerational trauma is.
Okay. And I hear the term ancestral trauma a lot. Is there a difference between intergenerational trauma and ancestral trauma, or are those terms interchangeable?
I think if you pull them apart, they're kind of, they blend together, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So when we think about our ancestors and a trauma that they have experienced, for example, I have a great grandmother who was put in an internment camp as part of trying to force the Navajo people to abide by the government policies. So that is ancestral trauma. What she experiences ancestral trauma. Intergenerational trauma, what that means is that as offspring, as a great grandchild of my grandmother, I may experience symptoms that she experienced as a young child. So fears, and not really knowing what's happening to me. For a long time, I had a lot of anger towards Anglo people. I'm not even sure if that's the right term. And I never knew where that came from. And as I started to do my own inner healing, I found out, and I recognized where it came from, is I started to ask questions from my mom about where was my grandparents, what happened to them, etc. And then I recognized that there was a pattern. So that's really what intergenerational trauma is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it falls in alignment with what we call, I study trauma, and I focus on developmental and ancestral issues that come through the lineage. Mm-hmm. And whenever it comes to trauma, there's always the discussion of epigenetics. Mm-hmm. And so in implicit memory and implicit bias, and these are really important things. So do you work with implicit memory, or, actively work with it? Or do you even use the term implicit memory? I bet you do work with it. You just might not.
I don't use implicit memory. I essentially use it as just the genetic coding of who we are as Native American people. And I do believe that it exists. And there's a lot of studies. One of the interesting things about epigenetics is there is a clear indication that emotions do get passed on from traumatic experience. If you think about our history in general within this country, if you take a more recent event that happened, 9/11, and you think about the families that were impacted by that, not only the emergency personnel that responded to that, but everyone else who saw that. There was a small school, if I was reading an article not too long ago about, there was a school close by that was children that were actually watching what was happening outside of their window. Mm-hmm. And you could imagine what that does to a child. Those memories will be instilled in them, and they will have those traumatic experiences as they become adults and not even recognize that. Mm-hmm. So there are some truths to what they're finding in epigenetics.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you've mentioned, a couple of causes. Are there any other causes of intergenerational trauma that you haven't yet covered?
Yeah, there is quite a few. For Native Americans, there's different phases or experiences that Native American people have gone through. And when I speak of Native American, I also include First Nations of Canada, because that's one of the things that's being done. But there's a group of researchers, Duran and Braveheart. Braveheart is an indigenous woman who works at the University of New Mexico, and she kind of categorizes into 6 phases, if you will.
Okay.
She talks about the first contact. This is when the Europeans came to this country, and there was that initial contact to Turtle Island. We call it Turtle Island because when you look at it from afar, like a space satellite image, it actually looks like a turtle. And there are some stories of the Native American communities about their origin stories and how that relates to the turtle. But getting back to the point on the first contact, here, when the Europeans arrived, they were systematically destroying the native people's way of life. And a lot of times it was around genocidal military actions. One of the biggest problems in healing this wound for Native American and Alaskan Native people is that this dark colonial history has never been acknowledged by our government.
Right.
You hear of, the Holocaust and how there's some resolution trying to happen between Germany and folks there. And the other part of this is that the truth of what really happened in history has never been written in our history books, at least none of the history books that I've learned from. And so the real truth has never been explained. And so that covers that aspect under the first contact. The second part of that was economic competition. And in this particular category, Native people suffered the loss of subsistence, both physically and spiritually. Food sources were destroyed along with their spiritual teachings. And an example of this is there was a government policy called a scorched earth policy. And this impacted, for instance, my ancestors on my mom's side, the Diné people, where the cavalry went through and essentially burned all of the crops, burned their homes, and they're getting close to winter time. And this was part of the military action to round them up so that they could herd them to the internment camp. And it was in a dead of winter. So they were running out of food. Their food sources were all gone. And so this was another action, and this happened throughout the United States. And then the third piece of that is the invasion war period. This is actually U.S. policies that were used to exterminate Native people across this country. An example that I can come up with, it's not only the U.S. government, but when the Europeans came over in the 1700s, there are written history of blankets being laced with smallpox that were given out to Native people. And as you well know, back then there was no cure for smallpox, there were no vaccines. And so it literally obliterated a lot of Native communities. And then a lot of those effects still happen to individuals, even to this day. The fourth phase is actually subrogation and the reservation periods, where you take an indigenous people who were free to roam, and then as there's white settlements started to come in, and Native people were treated as less than. And what ended up happening is they were forced to live on reservations. And a story that I told you about my great-grandmother who was put in this internment camp, that was supposed to be the original reservation in New Mexico for Diné and also Apache people. What ends up happening is the government releases them and then allows them to return back to the homeland, only to be forced onto a small piece of reservation land where they were, taught to be farmers. The one aspect that's really impacted indigenous people, not only here in the United States, but also in Canada, is the boarding school people, the boarding school period. There's a phrase, kill the Indian and save the man. And that was a policy where the government was actually creating boarding schools in which their intent was to destroy the Native American family structure. So once that family structure was destroyed, the culture could not continue on or exist. And so Native American children were forced to be removed from their families and sent off to boarding schools. And the most famous one that many people hear of is Carlisle Indian School, which was located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where boys were taught to learn a certain trade. And the girls that went to school there were taught to sew and perform housework. When these children arrived at these boarding schools, they were stripped of their native clothes and they were given colonial style clothing. Their hair was cut. And one of the things, when a young lady gets her hair cut, to a lot of indigenous people, their hair is very sacred, because that is a critical time in their life where they're being, we have these initiation ceremonies where you go from a child to a young woman, and you're going through your menses, and so your hair is important, and it's a part of that ceremonial that happens. One of the interesting cases that I read of was the Hopi people here in the Southwest. In 1894, there were 19 Hopi men that were actually arrested, put on a train here in Arizona, and taken to California, and then placed into maximum security at Alcatraz. Now, when we think of Alcatraz, we think of bank robbers, we think of murderers, etc.
Yeah, that's your hardened criminals.
Yes, yes. And their crime was that they rebelled against sending their children to these assimilation boarding schools, hundreds of miles away from home. And so these native children were forbidden to speak their language. They were not allowed to practice any of their traditional ceremonies, realizing that many of these children didn't speak any English. There is history cases of children being physically abused in order for them to learn the English language. Their given names as children were taken away from them, and they were given colonial first and second last names. Children were taught that their own culture was the work of the devil. And again, that's bringing in that Christianity aspect. They were physically, mentally, sexually, and emotionally abused. And Native children were also exposed to the cold. They didn't have the right kind of attire to keep them warm. There was illness, there was disease. And sometimes when these children died in these boarding schools, their family was never informed that their children had passed. And it's just a really sad experience. And so some of that continues on to this day. My mom was placed in a boarding school. And for me, that impacted me because I was never taught to speak my language, because she was afraid that this might happen to us. And so she never taught us that, because that was used as a tool to punish them. And then the last category, as part of this category of events that happened to Native American, was forced relocation and termination. Again, this is part of the aspect of placing them on reservations. In addition, one of the things, even up until the 1950s, there was about 100,000 Native American youth and young people that were sent to urban cities like Denver, like Los Angeles, and what the government was trying to do again was trying to assimilate them. They had made promises that they would have a place to stay, to try and get them up on their feet so that they could move on. And a lot of times when they showed up, there was nothing there for them. And so it's those that created a lot of mistrust, as you can see, for a lot of these events. And the bottom line to all of this is that this never allowed for Native people to actually heal from that grief. And so one event would happen, and then something else would happen, and on top of something else. And so it's no wonder we have the situation that we have right now,
Right.
High incidence of suicide, alcoholism, etc.
Right. Well, and that all makes sense, and just heartbreaking stories. And it's so unfortunate that really in our history books, we've been given a literally whitewashed version of history. And one of the reasons I believe that we as a country, as a nation, haven't acknowledged this and done anything to make reparations is because we're still doing it. So they're not going to fix it. This country is not going to try to fix anything. They're not going to acknowledge it as long as they're still participating in behaviors that are harming your communities. And when it comes to healing from trauma, healing does not occur when you're in survival mode. So when you have generation after generation, you're living most of your lives in survival mode. You're always in the fight, flight, or freeze, within your own physiology. That's not an environment for healing to occur. And this constant oppression keeps certain groups of people, the marginalized communities, and there's more than just natives. We've got the LGBTQIA community. We've got our Muslim communities. And just so many of them. Anything that's non-Caucasian, there's some sort of something going on, just to, I don't know. It's like, it's not fair. It's so overwhelming to talk about sometimes.
Yes, it is. It is.
Yeah. And I know you've alluded to this, a bit in your story, but I'm wondering if you'd get just a little bit more personal, like how has all of this affected you personally? Like what's been your personal experience through the trauma and healing and awakening?
Well, for me, I've experienced, just as described earlier, there's a lot of effects that come from intergenerational trauma. For me personally, my life has been touched by substance abuse from family members. My father died from alcoholism, primarily from cirrhosis of the liver. And I have other family members that have been impacted by that. And one of the things that I recognize as I start to read through history and my own personal experiences, that a lot of our men folk have forgotten their roles as Native men. They're supposed to be the ones that are the protectors, the providers. And because of all of these experiences that happened, they've lost a sense of who they are. I mentioned earlier about my great-grandmother. Her name was Bishtiba, who was one who rides with the soldiers with the scouts. She was put in an internment camp, and that's where actually she was born. And she was eventually released 2 years, and it took them 2 years to walk back to their homelands. Within my family and even my own self, I've had chronic health conditions where I've had to deal with the stress. Not only in my personal life, but when you live and you work in a corporate setting, that can ignite and flare up some of those memories that are in your body. And I spoke to the issue about boarding schools and how that has impacted my family, with my mom going to boarding schools. So there's a lot of different aspects of historical events that have, even though that they're in the past, they still affect me and then my community that I work with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And something I think a lot of our listeners are going to be able to resonate with, like you just said something to the effect of, like being in a corporate environment, can cause some of this stuff to come up. Mm-hmm. So what was your experience? What did you experience surfacing when you were in a corporate environment? Because a lot of my listeners are in that environment and might be experiencing signs and symptoms that they're not aware of that is related to trauma or even intergenerational issues.
Sure. So one of the things for me that was very difficult was when I was in that corporate setting, I was the only female. Mm-hmm. Sitting in a room of men. Again, we're talking about utility industry. And then I was the only Native American. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to tell them what it is that they needed to do to get in compliance with regulatory requirements. And a lot of times they didn't like that. And so it was really having to really dig deep in myself and try to find out what are those things that I was willing to let go of versus those things that were critical to manage the business. But in terms of the stress, there were long hours. I spent a lot of time on the road. And there's just this expectation in the corporate world that you have to produce. And sometimes it's at the cost of your health, which is eventually what happened to me. Is I ended up getting a really bad case of systemic lupus, and to the point where my body was shutting down. Mm-hmm. And so I had to be hospitalized for about 14 days in order for them to get to a place where they could stop that reaction. And then it took me probably 3 or 4 months to even just get back on my feet again. Mm-hmm. So that was when I recognized in my own self as I can't do that. And at that time I was working 7 days a week, 8 to 10 hours a day. And I said, I can't do this anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I had to figure out where my boundaries are. But I think that's the other part of ourselves, is that we don't establish healthy boundaries. And if we grew up in a family that was dysfunctional, we're always finding that we have to give. We forget about ourselves. And therefore, we don't set those boundaries that need to be established in order for it to be healthy.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I've had this boundary discussion with a lot of my personal clients, because I have clients all the time who are trying to set boundaries with other people. Like, no, that's not how it works. You set the boundaries with yourself and you stick to your boundaries. And whenever you stick to your own boundaries, by definition, you're teaching other people how to treat you.
Absolutely.
And they start to follow suit, and those who don't like it eventually fall off.
Mm-hmm.
And all the better whenever they do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because I think that's very common where people, like if I'm triggered, I'll try to make it your problem if something you said triggers me. Well, that's not your problem. That's my problem. My trigger, anything that triggers me is something that's not healed within me. And that's a signal. The trigger itself is a signal that I need to look within, not point the finger and blame you because you triggered me. How would you possibly know what my triggers are?
Right. And I think for me, one of the things that I always think about was a coworker once told me, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that, are you willing to step up and try to fight this battle, or is it something that you can allow to just let go of?
Mm-hmm.
The other part of it that you touched on was the ownership piece.
Mm-hmm.
We can own our own experiences and take ownership for what's happening to us, then we can change it. Whereas if we blame somebody else, we're giving that control away.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned, like Native American, Alaska Native, even First Nations. I'm a student right now of Gabor Mate's, and so we in that class we talk a lot about First Nations.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually leaving in a couple weeks to head to British Columbia. So
beautiful.
I'm excited about that trip.
Yeah, he does. He does amazing work.
He does phenomenal work. And, there's been a huge impact of intergenerational trauma on Native communities. So what are some of the biggest impacts that you see in current day Native communities or Indigenous communities?
One of the things that I see are their high rates of mental and physical illness.
Mm-hmm.
Suicide is actually one of the top issues for our youth. Suicide has become the second leading cause of death among Native American youth between the ages of 15 and 24. And actually, I was just reading this morning about some of the communities where a lot of their young people are just committing suicide, and they're at a point like, we've got to stop. We need to figure out what's happening here. But again, the problem is that I think for a lot of those people that are a little bit older and are elders, they're too close to the subject matter, therefore they can't really see, what the real issue is, and then get in there and deal with that. Substance abuse is another issue. For American and Alaskan Natives between the ages of 12 and older, they have the highest rates of substance abuse. So that's really impacted families. Violence. One of the things that has recently been brought to the forefront is the murdered and missing Indigenous women, mm-hmm. not only in the United States, but in Canada.
Yeah, in First Nations communities, that's what they're referring to as the red dress movement. Is that correct, to bring awareness?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's something that, again, we don't hear a whole lot about.
So the murdered and missing women, the real issue and the problem is that there have been a number of cases of murdered and missing women in this country. However, because of the jurisdictional issues associated with local police, and when I say local, or tribal police, on the reservations, they have their own tribal police system. And then you have the state, and then the federal, which is, usually the FBI. So if there's an instance where a non-Native commits murder or has violence against a Native woman, the tribal police don't have jurisdiction. The local communities, like the county sheriff's department, don't have jurisdiction. And it usually gets elevated to the FBI. And usually there's typically no response or very little response in actually following up on those cases. An example, there was a recent article that I read. There was 116, there was actually 5,712 cases of murder and missing women that were actually, that had actually occurred. And out of that grouping, there was only 116 cases that were actually documented in the Department of Justice's database. And so the issue seems really small when you look at those numbers. And so there's a big movement here in Arizona and across this country to try and get databases and improve that database system so that they can actually get a sense of how big this issue is.
Now, the numbers you just gave, is that across the North American continent, or
Yes.
is that concentrated to certain areas?
No, that's across the United States.
Okay. Because I was curious, like, is this something where it might be like a serial offender who's just getting away with things? I mean, or if it's a whole bunch of different crimes.
Yeah. And I, in my heart of hearts, I believe that this number is actually much more than 5,000. It's just that, how many things, and you got to think about reservations. They're very sparse. And so when something happens, the chances of even being reported is next to none. And so, and whether the local police or tribal police will do anything is another question. So that's one of the big things that happened. One of the interesting statistics that I read was that more than 4 out of 5 American Indian women experience violence in their lifetime. And that says a lot. I know in my lifetime I've seen violence and I've experienced that. So that's another one. There's also a lot of other effects that happen. I mentioned a couple of these. As we were talking, is the erosion and the destruction of traditional Native families and what that looks like. There's also a lot of child abuse and child neglect because, again, you're being raised by alcoholic parents that don't know how to nurture or care for you as a child. And overall, there's a high rate of post-traumatic stress disorder in Native American communities. So there's it's much really complicated issue, and there's no real easy, quick fix. And that's really kind of been my purpose for bringing this forward. I recently went back to my community, the Diné community, and went and held a presentation on intergenerational trauma and how it's impacted our Diné people. And interesting enough, the majority of the people that were in my presentation were actually non-natives. There were only 2 Diné people that were in there. And part of that is because a lot of our older generation, our elders, they always say, don't talk about it. The Wajinita, don't talk about that, because in some way they believe that will kind of be self-fulfilling if you talk about it and speak of it. But my viewpoint is that if we don't talk about it, we can't heal. And if we don't have that understanding, we can't heal as a people.
Right. And I would agree with that, with your perspective. And, again, coming from a perspective of working with trauma, especially developmental and ancestral issues, when these issues control and take over our lives, and they control our behaviors and our thoughts, is when we don't talk about them. So the deeper you bury that skeleton in the closet, the more likely that skeleton is going to be, pulling the strings and you're the puppet. And because these things that we hide away do have control over us. So you're exactly right. If you want to heal from them, it needs to come out into the light. It's on, if you want to make a metaphor, it's like the vampire. If you want to get rid of the vampire, put it out in the sunlight, shine light on it.
Well, I'm one to believe that everything has energy to it. And so if we have the anger and we have that anger deep inside of us, we end up with cancers. And so, some people just think, oh, I have cancer, and, deal with the medical course of action, but not really asking the question, why do I have this and where is this coming from?
Right.
And that's part of what you're speaking of.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there is a bitterness and resentment to anger. Now, I mentioned my teacher, Gabor Mate, and he wrote a book called When the Body Says No. And he says in that book, one of the ways that he got a lot of information was by reading obituaries. And he started to put 2 and 2 together on, like, what do cancer patients have in common? And, like, what do MS patients have in common? And it's about how they approach life and their belief system and their approach to life. And it's, I got to push through. I can't take time for myself. And there is my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and she passed away when I was young. And there is an element of resentment that goes along with it. So I believe that you're spot on with the anger and cancer.
Right.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
Yes, but I think it's an opportunity for a lot of us to heal that, and I think that's what's coming to me is that our generation is really the bridge between the past and the future.
Yes.
And if we can stop this cycle of trauma in our own families, it makes the collective a better place to live in. And I'm one to think that we're all brothers and sisters, and we have to live on this planet together. And I would rather be in a company of people that are like-minded, and so that we can grow together.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you believe that intergenerational trauma affects everybody?
I do. I have not met a soul in my life that hasn't had some kind of trauma in their life. And the more that I talk to people that are on this healing path, they start to make the connections in themselves of relationships that they have with their moms or their fathers, and how they've brought that in and how that's impacted their own lives. And, if they go one step further and ask the questions, how has this happened, in the past with my grandparents? Chances are you'll start to see a pattern, just like you were speaking of earlier about Gabor Mate and some of his work. I believe that there is, and especially if you've migrated from another country, your ancestors have migrated to another country, you might want to ask the question, why did they migrate? What was so bad that they had to leave their community of origin? And chances are that you'll find a lot of answers there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I can imagine that a lot of our listeners are probably wondering, gosh, do I have this intergenerational thing? So how does somebody know? Like, what are some signs and symptoms, or what are some ways that we could self-assess to figure out if we have intergenerational issues, and so we know if we need to reach out for help?
So I put together a 5 questions that you can ask yourself, and you can find that on my blog, on my website at www.kaloggi.com. And there are 5 questions that you can ask yourselves, and they're really basic. The first one has to do with what is your greatest complaint about your partner?
That's a good one.
The second question is, what are some adjectives or phrases that you use to describe your mother or your father? And what is your worst fear is another one. What's the worst thing that you could ever happen to you? What tragic events occurred in your family history? So those are kind of some talking points that, can, and part of the issue is to really use your partner as a reflection of yourself, because a lot of times the way we speak of others are really things that we're speaking ill of ourselves. And by going through these questions, you can do that. I've also put a video on there. And most of these questions that I pulled together were from a book called It Didn't Start With You. And it's by Mark Woolen.
Yeah.
I put his video on there as well, so that folks can take a look at that and see that this particular topic resonates with them.
Yeah, It Didn't Start With You was one of the recommended readings from my coursing with Gabor.
Yeah, it's a very worthwhile book to spend some time with.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. And so on the question, just for example, like what are some adjectives you would use to describe your mother? What are some words that might come up that might be a red flag? So if somebody, I know when I think of my mother, she passed away a really long time ago, but one of the first words that comes to my mind is neurotic. She was just absolutely neurotic. So is that a red flag word that there's intergenerational trauma?
Absolutely. So why was she neurotic? and kind of start to peel the layers of the onion back. For me, when I think of my mom, I think of my mom as controlling. And some of the words, she was a single parent, and she always used to tell me as a child, don't ever wait for a man to do anything for you. Get up and do it for yourselves. And so that made me very independent. So, I mean, if it took me 2 or 3, I could juggle things, I could multitask. And so that was kind of the thing that got instilled in me.
Yeah, my mom used to say the same things to me.
Interesting. They must have went to the same school.
Yeah, she did. She used to say the same things to me. She also said a heck of a lot of other things to me, because another way that I describe my mother is like she was like the queen of passive aggressive. Oh, yes. She had it down to an art form, and she taught me well. That's been hard to unwind out of my system, because I didn't realize until I was in my 30s how passive aggressive I was. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is not normal.
One of the things that I would also suggest for your listeners to also do is to really educate themselves about the true facts of our U.S. history and how they have portrayed Native American people, because chances are it's not the truth. And one of the things that I always do when I go to do presentations in another state or another city is I always acknowledge the original people of that land for their presence of being there. And again, the more you know about your own lineage, the more that you'll be able to answer a lot of the questions that you have, and that this conversation has, raised in yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think those are some really good tips that will get our listeners thinking, about, gosh, am I dealing with intergenerational issues? Now, if somebody does come to the conclusion that, yes, I'm dealing with intergenerational issues, then what next? I understand that you work with people.
Yes, I work typically in groups, and, I'm happy to work with people on an individual basis. I use a different approach to things. I use genetic coding as part of it. I'm very familiar with genealogy research because I've had to do that on my own path. I recommended some reading that folks can do on their own. But, if you really feel like you're really struggling, I would strongly suggest that you get with a therapist, and help the trauma therapist to help you work through some of those issues as well.
Yeah. And I'm curious, when you work with people, do you work with people locally in person, or do you work like this on video conferencing?
I can do that either or. Preferably, I prefer to do it online because sometimes I'm out traveling and it's easier just to get on the computer and do that online and have some conversation around that.
Okay. Well, that's good for our listeners to know that you're not geographically limited to who you work with.
No.
And so they can find you at your website, which is kalogii.com,
Yes.
which is www.kaalogii.com.
Yes.
Yeah. And I love that. You told me that Kalogi means butterfly.
Yes. When I was thinking of a name for a business, I was thinking of something that really impacted the work that I wanted to do. And it was really thinking of the transformation of a butterfly from, a caterpillar till the time that it blooms into its beautiful self. And to me, that's kind of similar to the conversation we had at the beginning of this call, was about going on that corn pollen path to what we're really here to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I especially love the butterfly analogy because I think most people think that when the butterfly goes into the cocoon that, the caterpillar, goes into the cocoon and just kind of grows wings and comes out. And that's not the case. That, like we dissolve into a disgusting pile of goo. And completely transform into something else. So I think that is such a perfect analogy for the healing, the transformation that comes through the healing process, because there is a period of time where internally and inside, it's almost like your soul feels like that disgusting pile of goo for a period of time. You're like, I don't know what to do with this. And then when you come out the other side, it's like, oh my God, this is a whole different world.
Absolutely. And for those that may be Indigenous or Native American or those that aren't, I also host sweat lodges at my home. I do that at every new moon. So for people to really go through that purification, to really get a cleansing of themselves and really try to figure out what it is that their ancestors are calling them to do. I also do women's circles, women's healing circles. And I typically have those scheduled on my website. I have those once a month where women come together and just really have a safe container to share what's on their mind. You know, if they're really working through some issues, is really to be there with sisters, you know, to help them through that process.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, we'll have to talk.
Yes,
I might have to come out and take part in one of those. That sounds fantastic.
You're welcome.
I would absolutely love that.
Yes.
Yeah. So before we, wrap up today, do you have any other places? I know we mentioned your website at kalogi.com. Do you have any other places or any other preferred ways for the listeners to reach out to you, or is that your preferred way?
That is my preferred way. You know, one of my, I love Carolyn Miss's work. It talks about the shadow work. I touched on that earlier, but a lot of times that's usually the place that we don't want to go to. And she has some beautiful books. She has some beautiful resources around doing shadow work. And I also do that, and I really focus on the individual, and it's really based on your birth, kind of like an astrology chart that really goes through and kind of peel back the onion. You know, I'm really here to be a facilitator more than you are to do the work. And really just kind of give you the tools to work through that yourselves. And sometimes it takes a long time to go through that process, which is okay. You know, there's no hurry in trying to get through all of this, but it allows you to be a better person.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you mentioned Carolyn Mesa's work, because I'm currently going through the language of archetypes for the third time, because every time, I'll skip, I'll listen to it, and then I'll skip a few months, and then I'll go back and I'll re-listen to it, because every time I listen to it, I get something new out of it. And I figure something else out. And I love that you mentioned shadow work. Carl Jung talks about the shadow, like the thing that we fear, and those parts inside of us that we fear to face. The shadow is 90% golden, according to Carl Jung. So we have our gifts and our talents and our creativity and all of those things that make us uniquely who we are, hidden behind walls and armor. And, and those walls and armor are built with emotions like fear and shame and anger. And we don't want to face our own emotions. So we bump into those emotional walls and those blockages, and we turn around and go the other way, or project those emotions out at everybody around us.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But I always believe that those challenges that we have in our life, there's a gift at the end. And it's just for us to make the decision to go through it, sit with the emotions, work through it. And then there's always something that's much more beautiful on the other side.
Absolutely. 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 So before we finally sign off, Belinda, do you have any final tips or bits of wisdom for our listeners?
I think I've shared with you as much as I've canned. I'll continue to put some resources on my website. I'm actually doing a blog right now on the mother wound, which is interesting because I find in my community that there's a lot of people really dealing with that. I've had to go through that. My mom is 87 years old, and on the weekends, I travel 5.5 hours to go spend time with her. And it's really given me an opportunity to change our relationship. But it's also, I see myself in her as well. So that's one of the things that I'm also going to be posting. I should be posting that here in the next week or so.
Oh, fantastic. Is there an option on your blog to subscribe or follow it so we get notices?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. If you go to the blog page, there's actually a little place that you can put your email in there. And as soon as an update comes, you'll be sent it.
Okay. I'm going to have to do that because I want to read that when it comes out. It sounds fantastic.
Absolutely. It's wonderful talking with you today, Jennifer.
Yes. Well, it's wonderful to have you on the show. And this is such valuable information. And I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of it. hopefully raise a little bit of self-awareness as to whether or not you have some of your own intergenerational issues that you might need to address. And if you do, I work with ancestral issues. Belinda works with these issues, and there are lots of therapists out there. My biggest piece of advice whenever you're shopping around for a therapist is find somebody that is relatable and somebody you feel safe with. If you don't feel safe with your therapist, for example, if you find yourself lying to your therapist, which I found myself doing in my 20s, you don't feel safe with them. That's a big clue, whenever they ask you a question and you give them half-truth answers, so find somebody you feel safe with, somebody you can be completely open, authentic, and honest with, and that will help you heal. This is Jennifer Whitaker with Yes And, signing off, and I will see all of you again next week. Have a fantastic day.
We have just concluded another episode of the Yes And podcast with Jennifer Whitaker. For additional resources, please visit our website, jenniferwhitaker.com. Leave a review if you enjoyed the show and find it useful. Until next time, continue challenging conventional thinking and keep moving forward.